In 1817, a British colonial clerk sat down in a parish office in Jamaica and began writing names into a ledger. He wasn't writing a family tree. He was writing a legal inventory. But buried inside those cold, bureaucratic pages is something that clerk never intended to leave behind. A direct paper trail connecting real people and their real descendants back to specific kingdoms, empires, and nations across West and Central Africa. 12 names on this list survived that system. If one of them is sitting in your family tree right now, you are not looking at a vague, romantic idea of African heritage. You are looking at a documented line back to an actual African kingdom, an actual ruling family, or an actual recorded rebellion against the very system that tried to erase where you came from. Stay to the end, because number 7 on this list is the story of a woman who was literally crowned queen on Jamaican soil in 1760. And along the way, we're also going to cover a name that sounds completely British on the surface, but hides one of the most direct African paper trails on this entire list. So don't assume you're excluded from this video just because your surname doesn't sound African at all. Between 1817 and 1832, every British colony in the Caribbean was legally required to register every enslaved person on the island. Their name, their age, and critically, whether they were born in Africa or born Creole, meaning born in Jamaica itself. These records, combined with plantation inventories, church baptismal registers, and runaway advertisements printed in Jamaican newspapers, form one of the most detailed paper trails of forced African migration anywhere in the historical record. And here's what most people don't realize. Colonial record keepers didn't just write down names, they wrote down nations. Enslaved Africans were routinely labeled by ethnic origin: Cromanty, Eboe, Congo, Nago, Mandingo, Chamba. 1803. Jamaican workhouse record alone documented over 1,000 runaway Africans, each one labeled by their specific homeland. Cross-reference those ethnic labels with the surviving surnames, nicknames, and family names that made it into the historical record, and you get something remarkable: a working map connecting Jamaican family lines directly back to named African kingdoms and empires. These labels weren't guesswork either. They were based on language, scarification patterns, filed teeth, and cultural markers that colonial buyers and plantation owners were, uncomfortably, trained to recognize on the auction block, which is exactly why they're specific enough for modern researchers to actually use. Today, we're breaking down 12 of those names and where each one genuinely leads. Here's something important to understand before we start. Most enslaved people in Jamaica were never given a formal hereditary surname the way we think of one today. Surnames usually only entered the record at baptism, at manumission, or at full emancipation in 1838. And when they did, they were sometimes chosen by the enslaved person themselves, sometimes taken from a sympathetic bookkeeper, and sometimes simply inherited from the plantation owner. That's exactly why the names on this list matter so much. These 12 managed to survive that entire filtering process, generation after generation, without being erased into a generic English surname. Every single one of them is still directly traceable through documented colonial paperwork to a specific African nation. Real quick, if this is new to you, tap subscribe and type your surname in the comments. Let's find out how many of you are sitting on documented African lineage. Surname 1, Cudjoe. Cudjoe comes directly from the Akan day name Quadwo, meaning born on a Monday, carried by enslaved people taken from the Gold Coast region of what is now Ghana. The name wasn't just common. It belonged to one of the most important men in Jamaican history. Captain Cudjoe led the Leeward Maroons, a community of self-liberated Africans who fought British colonial forces to a standstill for decades in the cockpit country, eventually forcing the governor of Jamaica to sign a peace treaty in 1739 recognizing Maroon freedom and self-governance. That's not folklore, it's a documented treaty, still studied today, and it granted Cudjoe's community 1,500 acres of land and formal self-governance, terms the British Empire almost never offered to anyone it had enslaved. The settlement he founded, Cudjoe's Town, later renamed Trelawney Town, still exists on Jamaican maps to this day. The name didn't stay confined to Jamaica either. Selwyn Cudjoe, a modern Caribbean scholar, traced his own line back to his great-grandfather Jonathan Cudjoe. Born in 1833, the final year slavery was legally in effect. If your surname is Cudjoe, your family carries the name of a man who militarily fought an empire to the negotiating table. Surname 2, Quashie. Quashie comes from the Akan name Quasi, meaning born on a Sunday, and it became so widespread among enslaved Africans in Jamaica that the name itself eventually entered everyday Jamaican speech as a term for an ordinary person. What most people don't know is that underneath that common usage, Quashie survived as an actual family name and nickname, passed down through real Jamaican households, documented in baptismal and estate records well into the 20th century. The female version, Quasheba, followed the exact same pattern for women born on a Sunday, and both names appear side by side in old Jamaican church registers, sometimes as a person's only recorded identity before a British surname was ever attached to them. It's a rare case of an Akan day name doing double duty, becoming both a piece of everyday Jamaican vocabulary and, quietly, a surname some families still carry today. Jamaican historians researching these old church books have specifically noted that the most useful baptismal entries are the ones that recorded both names side by side, the original African day name and the newly assigned estate name on the very same line, which is exactly the kind of document that lets a modern researcher walk a family's paper trail backward, past the English surname, straight to the Akan naming system it was layered on top of. Surname 3, Cuffee. Cuffee, sometimes spelled Cuffee, comes from the Akan name Kofi, meaning born on a Friday. In 1798, an enslaved man known as Cuffee escaped a Jamaican plantation and led a community of fellow runaways into the cockpit country, conducting a sustained campaign against nearby plantation owners so effective that Western planters described it as worse than the entire Second Maroon War. The name carried real weight elsewhere too. In Guyana, a man also known as Cuffee led the massive 1763 Berbice Slave Rebellion, one of the largest uprisings in Caribbean history. And in colonial New England, Paul Cuffee, a freeborn black ship owner and abolitionist, carried the same Akan name into American history as a documented ship captain, merchant, and community leader who personally funded voyages resettling free black Americans in West Africa. One single day name, 3 separate documented freedom fighters spread across 3 completely different colonial systems, all pointing back to the same Friday-born naming tradition on the Gold Coast. Surname 4, Quaco. Quaco comes from the Akan name Quaco, meaning born on a Wednesday. Captain Quaco co-led the Windward Maroons of eastern Jamaica alongside the most celebrated woman in Jamaican history, Nanny, now honored as one of Jamaica's official national heroes. Together, Quaco and Nanny negotiated the 1740 Windward Treaty, securing land and freedom for their community the same way Cudjoe had done in the West. Historians believe Nanny's own name may descend from the Akan honorific Nana, a title reserved for ancestors, elders, and rulers, meaning the 2 most powerful leaders of eastern Jamaica's Maroon resistance were, quite literally, carrying titles of African rank into the mountains where they built a free nation inside a slave colony. The community they founded, Moore Town, still stands in Portland Parish today, still recognized as a semi-autonomous Maroon settlement, and still home to descendants who trace their line directly back to Quaco and Nanny's original treaty generation. If this is landing for you, like the video right now, and drop a comment telling me which of these names you actually recognize from your own family. Surname 5. Quamina. Quamina comes from the Akan name Kwame, meaning born on a Saturday, and it shows up repeatedly across 18th and 19th century Jamaican plantation records. The name carries serious historical weight beyond Jamaica's borders too. In neighboring Guyana, a man named Quamina led the 1823 Demerara Rebellion, one of the largest and most consequential slave uprisings in British colonial history, involving over 10,000 enslaved people and directly influencing the British abolition movement back in London. Quamina's own son, Jack Gladstone, played a central role in organizing that uprising, and the British missionary John Smith was controversially tried and sentenced to death for allegedly supporting them, a case that scandalized abolitionists back in London and directly accelerated the political momentum toward ending slavery across the entire British Empire. If your family carries this name, you're connected to a naming tradition that produced organized, large-scale resistance across multiple colonies simultaneously. Surname 6. Cromanty. Cromanty, sometimes recorded as Cromanty, comes directly from Cromanty, the term British planters used for enslaved Akan-speaking people shipped through the English trading fort at Cormanty on the Gold Coast. Unlike the day names on this list, Cromanty wasn't a personal name. It was a national identity, and it stuck. Coromantys were involved in nearly every major slave rebellion in Jamaican history, most famously Tacky's Revolt of 1760, the largest uprising in the West Indies before the Haitian Revolution, led by a documented Fonte Royal named Tacky. The historian Philip Curtin estimated that a full quarter of all enslaved Africans imported into Jamaica between 1655 and 1807 were Cromanty. And colonial planters openly wrote that they were considered the most feared and the most valued captives on the entire island because of their military discipline. Genealogical records still show the surname Cromanty surviving among descendant families today, a direct linguistic fossil of the Gold Coast nation that shaped so much of Jamaica's early resistance history. Even the culture itself refused to disappear. Jamaican Maroon communities still practice a ceremony called Cromanty play today, a religious dance rooted directly in Akan and Ashanti spiritual tradition, meaning the word Cromanty survives not just as a surname on paper, but as a living ritual still performed by descendant communities in the present day. Surname 7. Cubah. This is the one I promised you at the start. Cubah, from the Akan female day name Cubah, meaning born on a Wednesday, belonged to a woman whose story sounds almost too dramatic to be real history, except it's fully documented. During Tacky's Revolt in 1760, the Cromanty community in Kingston crowned Cubah as their queen. She held court under a canopy, wearing a robe and a crown, ruling as Queen of Kingston in the middle of a slave colony, at direct war with the very government that claimed ownership over her. If your family carries the name Cubah or Cubah, you are connected to a woman who was literally, formally crowned on Jamaican soil. And Cubah wasn't alone at the top of that rebellion. Colonial accounts also describe a co-leader named Pongo, remembered in several sources as a captured African prince or ruler in his own right before he was taken and sold into slavery, meaning the leadership of Tacky's revolt may have included not one, but two people who had already held real royal or noble status back in Africa before Jamaica ever entered their story. Surname 8. Monteith. Here's the twist entry on this list, and it might be the most important one. Monteith is a Scottish surname, but it was carried directly by Archibald Monteith, a man born in Igbo land in what is now southeastern Nigeria under the name Aneaso. As a boy, Aneaso was kidnapped by an African slave trader, sold into the transatlantic trade, and shipped to Jamaica, where he was renamed after his enslaver. Remarkably, Monteith later wrote one of the only surviving first-hand memoirs by a formerly enslaved Igbo man, describing his kidnapping and enslavement in his own words. The lesson here matters for this entire video. A completely British-sounding Jamaican surname can sit directly on top of a documented African-born ancestor. Don't assume an English or Scottish name means there's nothing African-specific to find in the record. Monteith's memoir survives today because he converted to the Moravian Church and became literate as an adult. And Moravian missionary records in Jamaica preserved his account alongside baptismal and estate paperwork that historians have since cross-referenced with his own retelling of being taken from Igbo land. Meaning, his case is doubly documented, once in his own words and once in the colonial record that tried to erase where he came from. Surname 9. Nago. Nago, sometimes written Anago, was the term used throughout the slave trade for Yoruba-speaking people from the Bight of Benin in what is now southwestern Nigeria and the Republic of Benin. Even after emancipation in the 1830s, Yoruba and Nago, indentured laborers, kept arriving in Jamaica through the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, settling heavily in the western parishes of Westmoreland and Hanover. A group of them founded a village and named it Abeokuta, after their hometown back in Nigeria. A real city, still standing today, ruled historically by the Alaiks of Egbaland, a Yoruba king, whose royal line traces back to the legendary Yoruba ancestor Oduduwa. Two Jamaican place names, Nago Town and Nago Head near Portmore, still carry the name today. Families descended from this community usually carry ordinary British surnames from their indenture paperwork, but their identity, their rituals, and their place names quietly preserve a direct line back to a genuine Yoruba royal city. A sister community in neighboring Hanover Parish preserved a related tradition called Etu, an elaborate ceremony of song and dance performed on commemorative occasions to thank and honor the ancestors, still practiced by documented descendant families today, meaning the Yoruba naming and ritual tradition survived in Jamaica, not as a memory, but as an unbroken, living practice. Surname 10. Kongo. Kongo, as a documented surname carried across the African diaspora today, comes directly from the ethnonym for the Bantu-speaking Congo people of Central Africa, and specifically from the Kingdom of Kongo, a centralized African monarchy with its own currency, court, and formal diplomatic relations with Portugal, dating back to the 1480s, generations before most European colonization even began. After Jamaican emancipation, thousands of Central African, largely Congo-speaking indentured laborers settled in St. Thomas Parish, where their descendants still practice Quamina today, a living religion built on ancestor veneration, performed with ritual language rooted directly in Kikongo. If your surname is Kongo, you're carrying the name of one of Africa's oldest documented kingdoms. St. Thomas Parish still recognizes hereditary Quamina queens today, spiritual leaders who inherit their role through direct family lineage, leading ceremonies conducted partly in the Kikongo language and pouring ritual libations to specifically named ancestral spirits, an unbroken chain of religious leadership stretching from Central Africa through Jamaican emancipation into the present day. Surname 11. Eboe. Eboe, also recorded as Eboe or Red Eboe, was the term Jamaican plantation and workhouse records used for enslaved Igbo people from the Bight of Biafra in what is now southeastern Nigeria. Jamaica received more enslaved Igbo people than almost anywhere else in the Americas outside of Virginia. One 1803 Jamaican workhouse record of runaway advertisements alone documented 284 people labeled Ebos and Mokos out of just over 1,000 total Africans listed. Igbo influence still shapes Jamaican patois today. The word unu, meaning you all, comes straight from the Igbo language. And in 1815, roughly 250 enslaved Igbo people were involved in a documented conspiracy in St. Elizabeth Parish, one of several revolts that helped build the pressure that eventually forced abolition through the British Parliament. Igbo people arriving in Jamaica were also sometimes distinguished in colonial records by a lighter or yellow complexion, leading planters to use the nickname Red Eboe, a physical descriptor that, however uncomfortably, ended up serving modern researchers as another documented marker connecting specific Jamaican families back to the Bight of Biafra with real historical precision. Surname 12, Mandingo. Mandingo referred to Mandinka people, whose ancestral homeland stretched across the old Mali Empire and its successor states in West Africa. One of the wealthiest empires in recorded human history, ruled in the 14th century by Mansa Musa, widely considered the richest individual to have ever lived. That same 1803 Jamaican workhouse record listed 101 runaway Africans specifically labeled Mandingos. Enslaved Mandingo people were disproportionately literate in Arabic and practicing Muslims, and historians have documented several cases across the Americas of enslaved Mandingo scholars who left behind handwritten Arabic manuscripts, direct physical evidence connecting a name recorded in a Jamaican colonial ledger to the heart of one of Africa's most powerful and literate empires. Mansa Musa's own 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca is one of the best documented events in medieval African history, recorded by Arab chroniclers who described his caravan distributing so much gold along the way that it reportedly depressed gold prices across the region for years afterward. Meaning the name Mandingo connects a Jamaican colonial record directly to one of the single wealthiest and most historically verified rulers the world has ever known. 12 names, one island, and in every single case, a documented paper trail leading back to a real African nation, kingdom, or empire that colonial record keepers tried to reduce to a single word in a ledger. Akan names from the Gold Coast, a Cromanty ethnonym that survived as a literal surname, a Scottish name hiding a documented Igbo memoir, a Yoruba royal city rebuilt from memory in Westmoreland Parish, a Congo kingdom preserved today through hereditary Quamina queens in St. Thomas, and a name pulled straight from the empire of the richest man history has ever recorded. None of that was supposed to survive. Colonial registers were built to strip identity down to a number on an estate inventory, not to preserve a nation. They didn't succeed. The names survived, the stories survived, and if one of these 12 is sitting in your family tree, that history is still yours to claim, documented, dated, and real. One last thing. Subscribe so you don't miss the next bloodline breakdown, and comment the word ancestors if any of these 12 names showed up in your own family. See you in the next one. And if you know a family member who carries one of these 12 names, tag them in the comments too, because this is exactly the kind of history that's easy to lose if it only stays in one person's head.